When I came home from deployment in a wheelchair, I thought I'd survived the worst. But nothing prepared me for my brother's smile as he called me just a broken soldier in front of the whole neighborhood. What he didn't know was that every paycheck I'd ever sent, every sacrifice I'd made, was about to rewrite everything he believed he owned. The moment I handed him the title with my name on it, he realized too late. He was the one about to lose everything. And you won't believe what happened next. I used to believe coming home would feel like victory, that stepping back onto American soil, even in a wheelchair, would be enough. Enough to feel whole again, enough to feel wanted. But the truth was waiting for me in a chipped driveway in Springfield, Missouri, where my mother's azaleas hadn't been watered in months, and my brother stood leaning against the porch rail like he owned the place. I remember every detail of that morning. The sky was an unremarkable pale blue, the kind you forget as soon as you look away. My wheelchair rattled over the cracks in the cement, and I tried to steady my breathing, feeling my palms sweat around the cold metal rims. My uniform was crisp, my metals polished, but no amount of starch and shine could disguise the tremor in my hands, or the fact that I no longer stood as tall as I once had. The taxi driver pretended not to notice when my brother, Trevor, pushed off the railing and sauntered forward with that smirk he'd perfected in high school. The same one that used to get him out of trouble with teachers, girlfriends, creditors. He gave me a long, theatrical once-over, his mouth already twitching. Behind him, my mother clutched her hands to her chest, eyes wide, lips parted like she might say something. She didn't. "Look what the Army dragged home," Trevor crowed, raising his voice so the neighbors peeking through their curtains wouldn't miss a word. "You're just a broken soldier now, huh? All that talk about honor and sacrifice, guess this is what it gets you." The taxi engine idled, the driver studiously checking his phone. My ears burned. I could feel the blood draining from my face, the way it did before the morphine kicked in overseas. For a second, I thought I might black out right there on the driveway. But I swallowed hard and looked him straight in the eye. He didn't flinch. He never did. When we were kids, I was the quiet one, the boy who saved my allowance to buy books while Trevor blew his on cigarettes and cheap thrills. I thought the gap between us would close when we got older. I thought he'd find something he cared about, something worth fighting for. But Trevor always preferred taking the easy way out and mocking anyone who didn't. I adjusted the brake on my chair and tried to steady my voice. "Good to see you too," I said, though it tasted like ash in my mouth. Mom finally moved, shuffling forward and laying a trembling hand on my shoulder. "Jason, honey, come inside. You must be tired." Her voice cracked. Maybe she was ashamed of Trevor's words. Or maybe she was ashamed of me, ashamed that her eldest son came home in a chair instead of on his own 2 feet. I should have known then that the welcome I imagined was just a story I told myself in hospital beds when the pain was too much to bear. I'd pictured my brother clapping me on the back, my mother crying happy tears, the neighbors waving little flags. But the real homecoming was a single, cruel sentence, and the sour stink of stale beer drifting off Trevor's breath. As I crossed the threshold into the house, I felt something shift in me. Something small and vital breaking loose. All those years I'd wired money home from the desert, every paycheck I didn't spend on myself, every dollar I sent so they could keep the lights on and the roof from caving in. All those sacrifices, and for what? For a brother who laughed at my wounds. For a mother who looked away. I rolled into the living room where my father's old recliner still sagged in the corner. The curtains were drawn tight, the air heavy with dust and old grief. I reminded myself that I hadn't come home for Trevor's approval. I'd come home because, no matter how many bones I'd broken, this was still the house I'd saved. And when the time came, I'd remind him of that, remind him whose name was on the title he bragged about owning. But in that moment, I said nothing. I just gripped the arms of my chair until my knuckles turned white and promised myself this was not where my story ended. Sometimes I think back to when Trevor and I were boys, before bitterness and bad choices hollowed out the spaces between us. Back then, Our house felt bigger, even though it was just a squat brick bungalow on the edge of town. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and Dad's Old Spice, and Mom kept a jar of peppermints by the door. I can still picture the two of us running across the backyard in bare feet, the grass cool and wet under our heels. Trevor was always faster. He'd turn around, grinning, taunting me to catch up. And no matter how hard I pushed my little legs, he'd reach the porch first, slapping the screen door and yelling, "I win!" Dad would step outside, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, and lift me onto his hip. "Doesn't matter who wins," he'd say, voice low and steady. "What matters is you try. What matters is you show up." That was his mantra. Show up. Be the man who doesn't flinch, who doesn't fold when things get hard. It's why, even when money was tight, he refused to let Mom pawn her wedding ring. Why he kept showing up at the factory every day after his heart started giving out. And it's why, when he died, I was the one who held Mom while she sobbed against my chest, while Trevor disappeared for 3 days and came back drunk and snarling. I think that was the first time I understood we were different in ways that couldn't be bridged by blood. After Dad passed, something calcified in Trevor. He started acting like he was owed something by everyone. He quit his job at the auto parts store, said he'd figure it out. Months later, the notices started coming. Pink envelopes Mom would tuck under the phone bills, her hands shaking. I was stationed at Fort Hood back then, training medics to keep soldiers breathing long enough to get them to the field hospital. When I called home, Mom would insist everything was fine, that Trevor was trying. But her voice never quite matched her words. Sometimes I'd hear him in the background, shouting about how he deserved the house, how Dad would have wanted him to have it. He'd say it loud enough for me to hear, like he wanted me to. So I started sending more money. At first, it was just a couple hundred here and there, enough to cover the utilities. Then the mortgage fell behind. Then the taxes. I remember one night sitting in my barracks with the desert wind rattling the windows, staring at my account balance and thinking, this is the only way. I wired every cent of my re-enlistment bonus home that week, $40,000. Money I dreamed of using for a down payment on my own place, maybe a truck that didn't rattle like a tin can. I didn't tell anyone in my unit, didn't tell Mom the full amount. Just signed the transfer papers and went back to work. Because that's what you do when you're the one who shows up. But no amount of sacrifice could fix what was broken in Trevor. While I was stitching up soldiers and learning to live without sleep, he was sinking deeper into his own resentment. And somehow he convinced himself that the roof over his head had always belonged to him, that the debts I paid were his birthright, not my gift. When I came home in that wheelchair with my discharge papers folded in my breast pocket, I'd hoped that maybe, just maybe, he'd look me in the eye and see his brother, the same kid who used to chase him across the yard, who used to believe in him. Instead, he saw weakness, and he knew exactly how to twist the knife. As I lay awake that first night back, the house silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock, I thought about Dad's words. What matters is you show up. I had shown up, again and again. And now I was here to collect the truth they'd been trying to bury under years of excuses. Trevor didn't know it yet, but the title to this house was in my name. I'd made sure of it when I paid the last arrears. The paperwork was in my duffel bag, tucked between my discharge orders and the flag they'd given me when I left the hospital. He could laugh all he wanted, because soon the smirk he wore like armor would vanish, and I'd finally say the words I'd held in my chest all these years. The days after I came home moved slow, like the world had shifted into a lower gear just to spite me. My body was still learning how to exist in this chair, how to balance on wheels instead of legs. Every threshold in that house felt like an obstacle course. One more thing I had to conquer just to prove I hadn't been defeated. But the hardest part wasn't the stairs or the narrow doorways. It was watching Trevor pretend my sacrifice meant nothing. He'd slouch at the kitchen table with his coffee mug, scrolling his phone like I was an inconvenience he'd been forced to endure. When neighbors came by with pies and casseroles, more out of pity than kindness, he'd sigh dramatically, as if my presence disrupted the easy rhythms of his life. One afternoon, I found him in Dad's recliner, flicking through daytime television. He didn't even look up when I wheeled past. "You know," he called out, voice bored and cruel all at once, "you should probably think about selling your truck. You're never going to drive it again." I stopped in the hall, the words slicing deeper than I'd let him see. That truck was the last thing I bought before deployment, back when I thought I'd come home whole. I turned slowly, my fingers tight on the wheels. "I'll worry about my truck," I said. He lifted his gaze then, a lazy smile spreading across his face. "Sure. Whatever helps you sleep, man." It was always like that, snide remarks, little humiliations. He'd make a show of lifting boxes out of my reach, announcing how heavy they were in case anyone was listening. He'd roll his eyes when I asked for help with the front steps, then drag his feet until Mom had to step in. The worst part was how she tried to smooth it over, acting like his contempt was just another thing we had to live with, like the peeling wallpaper or the cracked foundation. One evening, after Trevor had gone out, probably to the bar he couldn't afford, I found Mom in the kitchen, drying dishes with hands that looked older than I remembered. "Mom," I started, my voice lower than I meant it to be, "why do you let him talk to me like that?" She pressed the towel to the counter, avoiding my eyes. "He's your brother," she whispered. He's had a hard time since your father passed." I almost laughed at how absurd it sounded, like my own losses didn't count, like my own scars were somehow easier to bear. "I've had a hard time, too," I said. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked so small I almost let it go. Almost. But something in me was done swallowing it, done pretending. "I sent everything I had to keep this place," I continued, my voice shaking. "I didn't do that so he could treat me like trash." Her eyes opened, shining with something between sorrow and guilt. "I know," she said softly. "I know what you did." "Does he?" She didn't answer, and in that silence I realized she'd been protecting him all this time, shielding him from the truth because she couldn't bear to see what he'd become. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom listening to the wind batter the siding. My mind wandered back to a moment I'd tried to forget. Kandahar, the explosion, the white-hot agony that swallowed me whole. The medic who saved me had squeezed my hand and said, "Hold on, Whitaker. You've still got something to come home to." I wondered if he'd been wrong. But even as the doubt tried to drown me, something steadied in my chest. I wasn't a broken soldier. I was a man who had given everything, more than Trevor could ever understand. And I still had one thing left that was mine: the title. The next morning, I wheeled into the kitchen as Trevor came stumbling home, reeking of stale beer. He paused in the doorway, bleary eyes narrowing. "What are you looking at?" he muttered. I looked him dead in the eye and felt a quiet, resolute calm. "Just waiting," I said, "for the day you figure out what you really are." He barked a short, humorless laugh and shoved past me. But he didn't know how close that day was, how soon everything he took for granted would slip right through his fingers. Because I was done being quiet, and I was done letting him pretend this house was his birthright. The tension in that house was thick enough to choke on. Every time Trevor and I crossed paths, it felt like an invisible line was drawn between us, a line neither of us was willing to step over first. But he didn't know he was living on borrowed time. I'd spent years trying to spare him the shame of admitting he couldn't provide for himself, that everything he had came from the brother he despised. But something shifted in me after that first week home. Maybe it was the way he laughed when I struggled up the ramp. Maybe it was the way he called me crippled under his breath, just loud enough that he could pretend he hadn't meant for me to hear. Or maybe it was the simple truth that I'd had enough. One afternoon, while Mom was out at the grocery store and Trevor was nursing a hangover in the living room, I wheeled into the kitchen and set my duffel bag on the table. My hands trembled as I unzipped it, the metal teeth catching on the worn fabric. Inside, Under the discharge papers and the folded flag was the manila folder that held every receipt, every notarized form, every wire transfer. Proof that I had paid off the mortgage. Proof that when the bank came calling, it was my name they thanked. I flipped it open, running my fingers over the embossed county seal on the title. Jason Whitaker, sole owner. I thought about waiting, about finding the right moment, some dramatic confrontation when the neighbors could witness his humiliation. But the more I considered it, the more I realized I didn't need an audience. The truth didn't require a stage. When Trevor shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and scratching his unshaven jaw, he stopped cold. His gaze fell to the folder, then to me. "What's that?" he asked, his voice rough. I didn't look away. "It's time you knew whose house this is." He smirked, though it looked forced this time. "Yeah? You think just because you threw a little money at the mortgage, you get to act like you own everything?" I kept my tone calm, measured. "Not like I own everything. I do. You've been living here on my dime for years, Trevor. Every bill, every payment, all of it." He laughed, though it sounded more like a bark. "You're full of it." I turned the title so he could read the name typed in bold black ink. His eyes flicked over the page, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, his face went completely still. "No," he said, voice hoarse. "No, this can't be real." "It's real." He shook his head, stepping back like the paper might burn him. "You think you're better than me because you played hero over there? Because you got yourself blown up?" His words should have hurt, but they didn't. Not this time. Because the truth was finally out. Undeniable and clean. "I don't think I'm better than you," I said quietly. "I just know I'm the only reason you're not sleeping under a bridge." His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. I watched him, waiting for the next insult, the next cheap shot. But none came. He just stood there, breathing hard, as if he'd finally run out of ways to pretend. When Mom returned an hour later, she found Trevor sitting at the table, staring at nothing, and me in the doorway with the folder resting in my lap. Her gaze darted between us, confusion wrinkling her forehead. "What's going on?" she asked. I met her eyes and saw something like relief flicker there, like she'd been waiting for this reckoning as long as I had. "I told him the truth," I said simply. Her shoulders slumped. She set her grocery bags on the counter and closed her eyes. For a moment, none of us spoke. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't triumph I felt then. It wasn't vengeance. It was something quieter, deeper, a release of all the weight I'd carried across continents and battlefields. The truth was, finally, between us, undeniable and unadorned. And though Trevor looked shattered, part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would finally start to rebuild himself from something real. But that was his choice. Mine was already made. The next morning, the house felt different, like some invisible tension had broken overnight. I woke before sunrise, the habit of years in uniform still too ingrained to shake. In the pale dawn light, I wheeled into the kitchen, half expecting to see Trevor waiting to hurl more insults. But he was gone. His battered sedan was missing from the driveway, and a note lay folded by the coffee pot. I hesitated before picking it up. The paper was cheap, lined notebook stock, and the handwriting was an angry scrawl. "Don't think this changes anything." Tea. I set it down and exhaled. It did change everything, whether he liked it or not. Later that morning, I made calls I'd been putting off since before my plane touched down in the States. The first was to Mr. Darnell, the family attorney who'd helped me finalize the deed transfer while I was still recovering at the base hospital. He was a precise, unflappable man in his 60s who'd handled Whitaker family paperwork since before I was born. "Jason," he greeted me when he picked up, his voice warm but measured. "I was wondering when you'd be in touch. How's your recovery?" "It's happening," I said simply. "Listen, I need to know. If Trevor tries to contest ownership, what does he actually have?" "Nothing," he replied without hesitation. "He's not on the title. He's not on the loan. All documentation is in your name. He can yell and threaten all he likes, but legally, he has no claim." His certainty steadied something in me. "I appreciate it," I said. After I hung up, I called the VA office in Springfield to confirm the adaptive equipment assessment for the house. It felt strange to be thinking about grab bars and doorway expansions when my family was unraveling. But the truth was, this was my home now, and if I was going to live here, I needed to make it mine in every sense. I was still on the phone with the VA when I heard the front door open. Trevor stomped in, reeking of whiskey even though it wasn't yet noon. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw set in a hard line. "You think you're so righteous," he spat, slamming the door behind him. "You come back here with your papers and your medals, acting like you're better than the rest of us." I ended the call calmly and turned to face him. "I don't think I'm better, Trevor. I think I'm tired. Tired of pretending you've earned respect you never gave." His nostrils flared. "Dad would never have wanted you to lord this over me." That old, familiar ache flared in my chest. Dad's absence was still a wound that hadn't closed. But even as Trevor invoked his name like a weapon, I knew the truth. "Dad wanted this family to stay together," I said softly. "You're the one who walked away from that. I did everything I could to hold it together. And you—" "What?" he barked, stepping closer. "I'm the screw-up? Is that what you want to say?" I met his stare without blinking. "Number. I think you already know who you are. I'm just done cleaning up after you." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before, something raw and uncertain leaking through all that swagger. For a moment, I almost reached for him. Almost. But then he turned on his heel and stalked down the hallway, the bedroom door slamming so hard the walls rattled. I sat there, the quiet seeping back in around me. My hands shook, but it wasn't fear. It was relief. This was the beginning of something different, something honest. That afternoon, Mom came into the living room where I'd parked myself with my laptop, the title resting beside me like a silent witness. She sank into the armchair across from me, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger, just a deep, weary compassion. "I know you tried," I said, "but he needs to face who he is, not who you hope he'll be." Her lip trembled and she reached for my hand. "You didn't deserve any of this." "None of us did," I murmured. "But here we are." And for the first time since I'd rolled back into that driveway, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could breathe again. The next few days passed in a strange, heavy quiet. Trevor stayed holed up in the back bedroom, venturing out only late at night when he thought I was asleep. Mom moved around the house like a ghost. Her shoulders bowed under the weight of all the years she'd spent trying to smooth over cracks that were never hers to mend. I spent my time making calls, sorting out VA benefits, lining up a home health aide to help me adjust to civilian life, talking to the bank about property tax schedules. Each conversation was a reminder that for all the damage done, I still had agency. I still had a future. One morning, as I was reviewing a stack of paperwork at the kitchen table, I heard the bedroom door open. Trevor emerged, his hair uncombed, eyes hollow. He didn't look at me right away, just shuffled to the counter to pour himself a cup of coffee with hands that weren't as steady as he liked to pretend. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The air was thick with everything we'd never said, and everything we'd finally laid bare. Then he cleared his throat. "I'm leaving." I kept my eyes on the page in front of me. "Where are you going?" He stared into his cup like it held the answer. "Don't know yet, but I can't stay here. Not like this." Part of me had expected this moment to feel triumphant, to watch him slink away, burdened by the shame he'd earned. But sitting there, looking at the man who'd once been my closest ally, all I felt was tired. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. He looked up, startled. "You should," he rasped. I shook my head. "I've spent too much of my life carrying anger. It doesn't fix anything." His mouth worked like he wanted to argue. But no words came, just a long, ragged exhale. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and for the first time it sounded real. I studied him, searching for sincerity in the slump of his shoulders, the rawness in his eyes. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that he was finally telling the truth. "I know," I said. "But sorry doesn't erase what happened. You need to figure out who you want to be." He nodded, a jerky motion that seemed to cost him. "You're not going to kick Mom out, are you?" The question landed between us like a challenge, but it wasn't one. It was the last scrap of his old defensiveness, fighting to survive. "She has a place here," I said, "as long as she wants it." He blinked, as if surprised I hadn't weaponized my ownership. Maybe part of him had hoped I would, so he could cling to his narrative of me as the enemy. But I wasn't interested in playing that part anymore. He swallowed, his gaze falling to the floor. "I'll get my stuff." I watched him walk away, the thud of his boots in the hallway sounding strangely final. And as much as I wanted to feel victorious, all I felt was a quiet ache, like I was watching the last of our childhood slip out the door with him. After he left, I sat there for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. The old pipes groaned in the walls, the wind rattled the window panes, and somewhere in the rafters, a sparrow had built a nest. Mom emerged from her bedroom sometime later, her face puffy with tears. She looked around, taking in the emptiness, the silence. "Is he gone?" she asked. I nodded. She sank into the chair across from me, her hands fluttering in her lap. "I don't know how we got here." "Piece by piece," I said softly. "Years of pretending nothing was wrong." Her eyes filled again, but this time she didn't try to hide it. "What happens now?" I thought about the folder in my lap, the paperwork that spelled out the future in black and white. I thought about the bruises I carried inside and out, the ones I'd earned and the ones that had been inflicted on me. "Now," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months, "we start telling the truth." For a moment she looked like she might argue. But then she nodded, her chin quivering, and reached across the table for my hand. And in that simple gesture, something shifted. Not everything was healed. Not everything was forgiven. But it was a start. The weeks that followed were the slowest kind of healing, the kind no one writes songs about. There were no triumphant reunions, no instant absolutions. Just the daily work of putting one foot, or in my case, one wheel, in front of the other. I spent hours on the phone with the VA and the contractors I'd hired to make the house accessible. Every day, men in work boots clomped through the living room with measuring tapes and clipboards, talking in low voices about ramps and widened thresholds. For the first time, this place was starting to feel like it belonged to me. Not because a piece of paper said so, but because I was shaping it with my own hands. Mom pitched in where she could, folding laundry and making casseroles like she had when I was a boy. Sometimes I'd catch her standing in the doorway, watching the contractors install handrails, her eyes far away. I knew she was thinking about Dad, about all the things she wished she'd done differently, about the son she'd lost to his own bitterness, and the son she'd nearly lost to war. Late one evening, after the workers had packed up and the house had gone quiet, I found her in the living room with her wedding album open across her knees. The pages were worn, the corners curling. She traced her fingertip over Dad's face in one of the photos. He was grinning, his arms slung around her shoulders. "He'd be proud of you," she murmured without looking up. I wheeled closer, my throat tight. "You think so?" "I know so," she said. "He always said you were the one who'd carry us through the hard times." For a long time I couldn't answer. My mind kept circling back to the memory of Dad in his work overalls, his voice low and certain. "What matters is, you show up." I hadn't always done it perfectly, but I'd shown up. Again and again, even when it broke me. "Mom," I said softly, "I don't want you to feel like you have to pick sides." She closed the album and looked at me, her expression older and sadder than I remembered. "I'm not picking sides. I'm just telling the truth. You did what no one else would." I wanted to argue that I hadn't had a choice, that sending every paycheck home hadn't been some noble sacrifice, but the only way I knew to keep the roof over their heads. But I stopped myself, because maybe, in the end, it didn't matter why I'd done it. Only that I had. After she went to bed, I stayed there in the living room, staring at the walls that held every argument and apology we'd ever spoken. The quiet pressed in, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence as before. This was something cleaner, a space emptied out so something new could grow. A few days later, the contractors finished the last of the modifications. The ramp gleamed in the morning sun, sturdy and smooth under my wheels. The bathroom door now swung wide enough for me to pass through without scraping my knuckles. It felt like a small victory, but a real one. That afternoon, as I rolled to the mailbox, I found an envelope with Trevor's handwriting. My heart clenched. For a moment, I considered tossing it in the trash. But I couldn't. Not yet. I opened it right there, the breeze tugging at the paper. "Jason, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I even deserve it. I'm trying to figure out who I am without the excuses. I'm not good at this, but I needed you to know I'm sorry. I hope someday you can believe that. T." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I didn't know if I could forgive him. Maybe I never would. But I felt something loosen in my chest, a release I hadn't known I was waiting for. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the cottonwoods. The air smelled of cut grass and honeysuckle. For the first time in years, I felt settled. Not healed. Not yet, but closer. When Mom came out to join me, she didn't say anything. She just sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. And in that stillness, I realized something I'd forgotten in all the chaos and resentment. This house had always been more than walls and paperwork. It was memory. It was the place that had shaped us, wounded us, and, maybe, just maybe, might save us. I used to think resilience was about never bending, never breaking, never letting anything crack the armor you'd built around yourself. The Army taught me how to keep moving forward, no matter how deep the wounds ran. But nobody taught me how to come home to a place where the deepest cuts weren't the ones I carried on my body. In the weeks that followed Trevor's departure, I discovered that healing didn't look like I'd imagined. It wasn't a single moment of catharsis or forgiveness that wiped the slate clean. It was smaller, quieter than that. It was the steady rhythm of ordinary days, of learning how to cook breakfast from my wheelchair, of helping Mom sort through Dad's old tools in the garage, of sitting on the porch in the evenings and listening to the cicadas hum in the grass. Some days, the old anger flared up without warning. I'd catch myself replaying Trevor's words, "You're just a broken soldier," and feel my jaw tighten, my hands curl into fists. But more often now, the memories didn't burn the way they used to. They just sat there, part of the past, but no longer in charge of the present. One Saturday morning, I found the letter again in the pocket of my jacket. I read it twice, tracing the uneven handwriting with my thumb. For a long time I just sat there on the edge of my bed, the words echoing in the quiet room. I didn't know if Trevor was living in some cheap motel or if he'd finally found a place of his own. I didn't know if he was sober, if he was still angry, if he was trying. But the thing about family, about the kind of bond forged in childhood and bruised by 1,000 small betrayals, is that it doesn't disappear just because you wish it would. I set the letter on the nightstand and let out a long, shaky breath. I didn't forgive him. Not yet. But maybe forgiveness didn't have to be the destination. Maybe it was enough, for now, to stop hating him. That afternoon, Mom and I sat together at the kitchen table, sorting through a shoebox of old photographs. She pulled out one of Trevor and me in the backyard. Me in my hand-me-down baseball cap. Him with his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning like nothing bad could ever happen. I felt a pang deep in my chest, but it didn't hollow me out the way it once would have. "He wasn't always like this," she murmured. "I know," I said quietly. She turned to me then, her eyes wet but clear. "I think you saved this family in more ways than you'll ever understand." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I'd failed as much as I'd tried. But I couldn't, because maybe she was right. Maybe showing up had been enough. Later that evening, I wheeled out onto the porch one last time before dusk settled over the neighborhood. The air smelled like the promise of rain. I watched the breeze ripple through the cottonwoods and felt something I hadn't in a long time. A sense of possibility. I thought about all the men I'd treated overseas, about the way we'd hold each other's hands and promise that the worst moments wouldn't define us. That when we came home, we'd find a way to start over. Maybe that promise was still worth keeping. As the last of the daylight slipped behind the trees, I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me. This house would never be perfect. Neither would this family. But it was mine. And for the first time since the wheels of my chair touched that cracked driveway, I believed that was enough. Because legacy isn't measured in titles or deeds or medals. It's measured in the moments you choose to stand your ground, to tell the truth, to love something broken anyway. And if that made me a broken soldier, then I'd carry that title with pride.